I have stood post in the East Gallery of Harrowgate Palace for 19 years, and in all that time I have learned that the loudest things a person ever says are the things they say with their face when they believe no one trustworthy is watching. A guard is furniture to people like Countess Veridine Salomir. We are gilded fixtures, brass-buttoned and bare-skinned, set against the cold stone the way the portraits are set into their frames, present, polished, and presumed deaf. That presumption is the only freedom a man in my position is ever given, and I have spent 19 years learning to use it. So when she swept past my post that gray morning in the first week of the spring session, her heels striking the marble like a clock that had decided to run fast, I did what I always do. I did nothing. I looked at the middle distance, at the seam between two flagstones near the far doors, and I let her go by as though I were a column of the gallery itself. But I saw her face. I always see the face. And the Countess's face, that morning, was the face of a woman who had just been told something she could not survive being true. She had a letter in her gloved hand. Cream paper, the Queen's own seal, I knew the wax color, that deep oxblood red the household used for personal correspondence rather than affairs of state. She held it the way you hold something that has bitten you and might bite again. Her knuckles were white through the kidskin. Her mouth, painted that morning into its usual confident line, had come loose at one corner. And her eyes, as she passed within an arm's length of my post, were doing something I had never seen them do in the 4 years I had watched her glide through these halls as though she owned the air in them. They were calculating how to lie about something that could not be hidden. You will want to know who she was, so that you understand what it meant for her face to do that. Countess Veridine Salomir was, by her own steady account, the most necessary person in the kingdom of Eldermoor. She would not have said it so plainly. She was far too clever for plainness, but every word she spoke was built on the foundation of it. She was the senior lady of the privy household, which is to say she controlled the small and constant traffic of access. Who sat where at the long table, whose petition reached the Queen's desk this week and whose waited until it no longer mattered, which visiting delegation was warmed by an hour in the rose antechamber, and which was left to cool in the draughty stone hall. None of these powers was written down. All of them were real. She had spent 20 years turning the invisible machinery of a palace into a thing that ran on her approval, and she had done it so quietly and so well that half the court believed the machinery had always run that way and the other half had stopped being able to imagine it running any other. And she did not like the Queen. That was the thing you learned slowly, watching from a post. Not that the Countess opposed Queen Saralind. Opposition is loud, and the Countess was never loud, but that she had built her whole long position on the unspoken premise that the Queen was a decoration, a figurehead to be managed, a young woman who had come to the throne under hard circumstances, and who, in the Countess's private estimation, needed a steady hand behind her to keep the realm from sliding into the sea. The Countess believed she was that hand. She believed it the way a person believes in gravity, without effort, without examination, as the plain shape of the world. And for a long time, the world had let her believe it. Queen Saralind of the royal House of Harrowgate was 34 years old that spring. She had 2 children, Prince Joran, who was 10 and grave, and Princess Malin, who was 8 and was not grave at all, and a husband, the Prince Consort Aldrich, who was the rare sort of man content to stand a half step behind his wife and proud to do it. The Queen was, in the plainest terms I can give you, good. I do not mean she was pleasant, though she was. I do not mean she was kind, though she was that too. I mean that she was good in the difficult, unglamorous, load-bearing way, the way that costs something every single day and never asks to be thanked for the cost. She read every petition that reached her, and after a while she began to notice which ones reached her late, and which ones never reached her at all. She remembered the names of the people who cleaned the galleries and the names of their children, and she had a habit, when a hard decision came before her, of asking not what is easiest, but what is right, and what will it cost, and am I willing to pay it, 3 questions, always in that order, and I had heard her ask them aloud more than once when she thought the gallery was empty except for the furniture. The furniture heard everything. So I knew, that gray morning, 2 things at once that the rest of the court did not yet know. I knew that something in the Queen's own hand had reached the Countess and undone her. And I knew, from 4 years of reading that proud face from the corner of my eye, that the Countess Veridine Salomir would not accept being undone. She would fight it. She would scheme against it. She would spend whatever she had to spend to put the world back into the shape where she was the necessary one and the Queen was the decoration. And because I was furniture, I would see the whole of it, every move, every lie, every careful cruelty, and I would not be permitted to say one word until the moment, if it ever came, when duty itself demanded that I speak. That is the burden of my post, and I will not pretend to you that it is an easy one. There is a particular kind of strength required to watch a wrong unfold and hold your peace, because holding your peace is the duty you swore. People imagine a guard's discipline lives in his straight back and his still hands. It does not. It lives behind the eyes, in the constant act of seeing clearly and saying nothing, of being a witness who may not testify. I have held that discipline through provocations that would have moved a statue. But I will tell you honestly that holding it through the spring of that year, through everything the Countess did, and everything she tried to do, and the long, slow way it all came apart in her hands, was the hardest stillness I have ever kept. This is the account of how a proud woman who had run a palace from the shadows for 20 years lost everything she had built, and lost it not to an enemy or an accident, but to herself, to the exact qualities she was most certain were her strengths. It is the account of how a good queen won the heart of an entire realm without ever once setting out to win it, simply by being who she was when it was hardest to be. And it is the account of what one guard saw, standing still in the corner of it all, forbidden to move, until the single moment when the whole thing turned. Let me begin where it began for me, not with the letter, which I would not understand until much later, but with the small cruelty I watched the Countess perform 3 days before, the one that told me the season was going to be a hard one. It was a cruelty so quiet that I am certain no one else in the room recognized it as anything at all. Her name was Mistress Orsa, and she had come to the palace to ask for her son's life. I should say plainly that no one's life was truly in danger. This is not that kind of story, and the realm of Eldermoor in those days was a settled and lawful place. But to Mistress Orsa it felt like a matter of life, and a thing felt is a thing real to the one feeling it. Her son was a fisherman of the northern coast, in the town of Lethwick, where 3 winters of failed catches had left the whole community owing more to the crown's grain stores than the whole community could ever repay. The law was the law. Debts to the grain stores were called in each spring, and those who could not pay forfeited their boats. A fisherman without a boat is a man with no future, and a town full of such men is a town that empties within a generation. Mistress Orsa had come 300 miles, on foot for the last 60 when her coach money ran out, to ask the only thing she could think to ask, that the Queen see the matter herself with her own eyes before the boats were taken. To reach the Queen's eyes, she had to pass through the Countess. I watched it happen in the Rose antechamber, where I stood the morning post that week. Mistress Orsa had been waiting since before dawn, a square-built woman in a coat that had been good 20 years ago, her hands red and cracked from a lifetime of nets and cold water, a petition rolled in oilcloth pressed against her chest as though it were the last warm thing she owned. She had been told by the Countess's people, who told everyone such things, that the Queen might receive a few petitioners that morning if time allowed. So she waited, and the Countess made certain that time did not allow. It is a small art, the wasting of someone's hope, and the Countess was a master of it. She did not refuse Mistress Orsa. Refusal can be appealed, complained of, remembered. Instead, she managed her. A clerk was sent to take down the particulars. That took an hour. The particulars were found to be on the wrong form. That took another. The right form required a seal from the Office of Coastal Revenues, which did not open until 10, and which, the Countess regretted, was 3 corridors distant and could not be reached and returned from before the Queen's mourning was, alas, fully committed to the delegation from the southern provinces. All of this was delivered to Mistress Orsa in a voice of warm, unhurried sympathy, by the Countess herself, who actually knelt, in her fine gray silk, on the cold marble, to be at the level of the seated, exhausted woman, and held her cracked red hands in 2 soft gloved ones, and told her how very deeply the household felt for the people of the coast, and how she must come back tomorrow, and how everything would surely be arranged. There was no tomorrow in it. I knew that, and the Countess knew that, because the boats of Lethwick were to be called in at the end of that very week, and the Queen would be at the Spring Assize in the Western Shires by tomorrow noon, and would not return for 9 days. The Countess had simply, gently, kindly, run out the woman's clock, and had done it in a posture of such tender concern that Mistress Orsa rose from that bench believing she had been comforted by a great lady, and walked out of the palace grateful to the very person who had just quietly ensured she would lose everything. That is what I mean when I say the Countess was clever and that her cruelty was quiet. She never once raised her voice. She never once said no. She wept almost with sympathy. And she put a knife in a fisherman's family with a smile and a held hand, and counted it, I am certain, as a morning's good work, one more piece of the machinery managed, one more inconvenient feeling soothed back into the corner where it belonged. The Queen would never hear of Lethwick. The boats would be taken. The system would run smooth, and the Countess would remain, as ever, the necessary hand. I watched Mistress Orsa walk out into the gray morning, clutching her useless oilcloth roll, and I held my post, and I said nothing, because saying something was not mine to do. But I will tell you that the seam between those 2 flagstones, the one I fixed my eyes upon to keep my face still, blurred for a moment. 19 years of discipline and a worn-out fisherwoman with cracked red hands nearly broke it in the space of an hour. That is the cost the Bible of my profession never mentions. The stillness is not free. It is paid for, every time, out of something in the chest that does not grow back quickly. What the Countess did not know, what she could not have known, because she had built her whole life on the certainty that the Queen was a decoration to be managed, was that the machinery she trusted so completely had developed a flaw she had not accounted for. The flaw was the Queen herself. Saralind had begun, that winter, to wonder why so many of the petitions that reached her seemed to come only from the well-connected and the near at hand, and so few from the distant and the poor. She had begun to ask quietly for the lists, the records of who had requested an audience and who had received one, and to read them in the evenings, the way some people read accounts and others read scripture. And somewhere in those lists, in a clerk's dry notation, was a line about a woman from the northern coast who had requested an audience regarding the Lethwick grain debts, and had been recorded as withdrawn, particulars incomplete. The Queen, reading that line 3 days later by candlelight, did not believe a woman who had walked 60 miles on foot had withdrawn over an incomplete form. I did not know any of this yet, of course. I knew only what I had seen. A fisherwoman comforted out of her last hope, a Countess pleased with herself, a system running smooth over the top of a small buried cruelty. I went home that night to my narrow rooms in the guards' quarter, and I did not sleep well. And in the morning I returned to my post, and 3 days after that the Countess swept past me in the East Gallery with the Queen's oxblood seal in her white-knuckled hand, and the look on her face of a woman who has just discovered that the decoration can see. That was the inciting moment, though I did not name it so at the time. The letter in the Countess's hand was a summons. The Queen had learned of Lethwick, not the whole of it, not yet, but enough, and had written, in her own hand rather than through any clerk, to inform the senior lady of the privy household that Her Majesty would be reviewing, personally, the handling of all coastal petitions for the season, and that the Countess would attend her in 3 days' time to account for the disposition of one in particular. The Countess had spent 20 years making certain the Queen never looked too closely at anything. Now the Queen was looking directly at her, and every move she made from that morning forward, every clever, frightened, escalating move, was an attempt to turn the Queen's eyes away again before they saw the whole shape of what they were already beginning to see. She would not turn them away, but it would take the whole of the spring to prove it, and a great deal would happen first. The Countess's first move was the obvious one, and I will give her this, she made it well. She went to the records herself. I know this because I drew the night post at the archive stair that week, the cold marble corridor outside the rooms where the household's papers are kept, and at 11:30 on the evening after she received the Queen's letter, she came down the stair with a single candle and a key she had no business holding, and she let herself into the petition records and stayed there until nearly 2 in the morning. I stood my post. I did not move. A guard at the archive stair is there to keep the wrong people out, and the Countess was, by every rule the palace had ever written down, exactly the right sort of person to be in those rooms at any hour she pleased. She was the senior lady of the privy household. The records were, in a sense, hers to keep. So I had no cause to challenge her, and I did not, and I watched the candlelight move behind the frosted glass of the archive door for 2.5 hours, while the most powerful woman in the palace did something to the record of a fisherwoman's withdrawn petition. I did not know what she did. I could only see the light, but I knew what kind of thing it would be because I had spent 4 years learning the shape of her mind. She would not destroy the record too crude, too easily noticed, and the Queen already had whatever she had that prompted the letter. No, she would amend it. She would add to the line, withdrawn, particulars incomplete, some small true-sounding addition, a clerk's note in a clerk's hand that she had the skill to forge, explaining that the petitioner had been offered a return appointment and had declined it, that the matter had been referred onward to the proper office of coastal revenues per standing procedure, that everything had in fact been handled with perfect correctness, and the only failure was the petitioner's own. She would build in those 2.5 hours a paper version of the morning in the Rose antechamber, in which she had done nothing but help. And it would be good work. When she came down the stair at last and let herself out and locked the archive behind her and passed my post without a glance, her face had recomposed itself entirely. The white knuckles were gone. The loose corner of the mouth had been tucked back into its confident line. She had a plan now, and a woman with a plan is a woman restored. She nodded to me, the first time in 4 years she had acknowledged my existence, a small, gracious, mistress of the house nod, the nod you give a piece of furniture you have decided to be pleased with. "A cold night for it," she said. "You serve well." And she went up the stair to her rooms to sleep the sleep of the righteous. I held my post until the dawn relief came. And in the cold hours I understood that I had just watched the first move of a long game, and that I was the only person alive who knew it had been made, and that I could do nothing with the knowledge. I had not seen her commit a crime. I had seen a great lady visit her own archives by candlelight, which is no crime at all. If I went to the captain of the guard and said I suspected the senior lady of the privy household of forging a clerk's note, I would be the one whose judgment was questioned, and rightly, because I had no proof beyond a moving candle and 4 years of reading a face. So I did the only thing the discipline of my post allowed. I remembered it. I fixed it in my mind exactly, the date, the hour, the key she had no business holding, the 2.5 hours, the recomposed face, and I filed it away against the day, if it ever came, when remembering clearly would be the one thing required of me. This is the part of a guard's discipline that no one writes songs about, not the standing still while a tourist shouts in your face. That is nothing. That is an afternoon's annoyance. The real discipline is the long patience of the witness, to see a wrong begin, to know it for what it is, and to carry it silently for as long as it takes, never acting too soon, never speaking out of turn, holding the knowledge clean and unspent until the exact moment it can do its work. Act too early, and you are a liar with a suspicion. Wait too long, and you are a coward who watched. The whole art is in the timing, and the timing is not yours to choose. It belongs to the truth, which surfaces when it surfaces and not before. I would carry the candlelight in the archive for 2 months before its moment came. The Countess's second move was bolder, and it was aimed not at the record but at the woman. Mistress Orsa, you see, had not gone home. A woman who walks 60 miles on foot to save her son's boat does not simply turn around and walk 60 miles back because a great lady held her hands and said, "Come tomorrow." Mistress Orsa had found a cot in a charity house near the river quarter, 2 miles from the palace gates, and every morning that week she had come back and stood outside the gates with her oilcloth roll, asking the porters whether today might be the day. The porters, who were good men, had begun to bring her bread. Word of her had begun to move through the lower palace the way word does the fisherwoman at the gate, the one who walked, the one who only wants the queen to look. The Countess heard of it because the Countess heard of everything, and a fisherwoman at the gate, talked of in the kitchens and the porter's lodge, was a loose thread in the smooth paper version of events she had spent a candle-lit night sewing. So she had Mistress Orsa removed. Not cruelly, never cruelly, not where it could be seen. A clerk of the household went out to the gate with a purse of coin and a kind word, and the news that the matter of the Lethwick debts had been referred to the proper office and was being handled with all due care, and that the good woman should take this token of the household's concern and return home to her family, who surely needed her. The coin was real money, more than Mistress Orsa had ever held at once. The clerk was gentle. The whole thing looked, to anyone watching, like generosity. And Mistress Orsa, who was no fool but who was tired and far from home and out of any other idea, took the coin because what else was there to do, and the porters watched her walk away up the river road with her roll under her arm, and that, the Countess believed, was the loose thread cut. I learned of this the way I learned of most things from the porters, who talked to the gate guards, who talked to the gallery guards, in the low constant murmur that runs under any great house like water under ice. And I confess that, when I heard the fisherwoman had taken the coin and gone, something in me eased, which shames me to admit. Because a part of me had wanted it to be over, had wanted the uncomfortable thing settled, the loose thread cut, the smooth paper version to win, so that I could go back to the simple stillness of my post without the scene between the flagstones blurring on me. That is the small corruption the Countess relied upon in all of us. She did not need us to be cruel. She only needed us to prefer comfort, and to look away when comfort offered itself, and most of us most of the time obliged her. But the Queen did not oblige her. That is the whole of it in the end. The Queen was the one person in the palace who, offered the comfortable looking away, chose instead the costly looking closer. And 4 days after Mistress Orsa took the coin and started home, while the Countess slept the sleep of the righteous in her fine rooms, Queen Saralind sat up late over her petition lists once more, and found that the line about the woman from the northern coast had grown, that, where there had been withdrawn particulars incomplete, there was now a fuller, neater, more reassuring account in a clerk's hand, of a matter properly referred, and a petitioner properly compensated, and everything properly closed. And the Queen, who had a good memory and a careful mind, noticed that the ink of the edition was a slightly different black from the ink of the original line, and that the clerk whose hand it claimed to be had been abed with a fever the entire week the edition claimed to have been written. I did not see the Queen make that discovery. I was not at her shoulder, and she told no one of it at the time. But I felt the consequence of it within 2 days, the way you feel a change in the weather before you can name it. The palace grew quietly busier. Riders went out from the stable yard at hours when riders did not usually go. A clerk of the Coastal Revenue's office, a careful little man named Brevis whom I knew slightly, was summoned to the Queen's study 3 times in 1 week and came out each time grayer than he went in. And the Countess, who could read the palace's weather as well as anyone alive and better than most, began, for the first time in the 4 years I had watched her, to look hurried. This is the thing about a person who has held power a long time without ever being checked. They lose the muscle of restraint because they have never had to use it. The Countess had spent 20 years getting her way by being patient, gracious, and unhurried, because the unhurried always win when no one is willing to oppose them. But now someone was opposing her quietly and from above, and she did not know how to be patient under pressure because she had never had to be. So she began to move faster, and the faster she moved, the more she left behind her the very thing that had made her dangerous: the smoothness, the invisibility, the appearance of having done nothing at all. Her third move was where the smoothness cracked. She decided that the problem was not the record and not the fisherwoman but the people who knew about both, the porters, the clerks, the low murmur under the ice. And she set about, in the space of a fortnight, to silence that murmur by the only method she truly trusted: the management of access, the threat of it withdrawn. She did not threaten anyone directly. She was still too clever for that. But the porter who had brought Mistress Orsa bread found himself reassigned, suddenly, to the cold outer kennels 2 miles from the gate. The clerk Brevis, who had been so often in the Queen's study, found his lodging in the palace withdrawn for renovations, and himself moved to a damp room in the undercroft. Small things, deniable things, each one explicable on its own as ordinary household business. But taken together they spelled a single sentence to anyone with eyes to read it. The people who had touched the matter of Lethwick were being punished, quietly, one at a time, and everyone who watched understood that they would be next if they spoke. The murmur under the ice went silent, and the Countess, hearing the silence, mistook it for safety. I want to be honest about my own part in that silence, because this is not a story in which I come off clean. I, too, went quiet. I, too, watched the porter reassigned and the clerk moved to the undercroft and understood exactly what it meant, and I, too, said nothing and did nothing and told myself that nothing was mine to do. And the difference between me and the silenced clerks was not courage. It was only that my silence was, for once, the right silence, the disciplined silence of a witness biding his time, while theirs was the wrong silence, the frightened silence of men with something to lose. But it did not feel different from the inside. From the inside, fear and discipline can wear the same face for a long while, and it takes an honest man to know which one he is actually wearing. I told myself I was biding my time. I prayed in the cold hours of the night post that I was telling myself the truth. The midpoint of that long spring, the moment the whole game changed, came not from the palace at all, but from the sea. In the last week of the Countess's fortnight of quiet silencing, a storm came up the northern coast. Not an ordinary storm. The kind that the old fishermen of Lethwick measured their lives against. The kind that comes once in a generation and rearranges the shoreline. It struck at night with no warning the harbor masters trusted, and it caught the Lethwick fleet, those same boats that were to be forfeit for debt at season's end, out on the water, and it threw the whole town into the worst night it had known in 40 years. And here is where the two halves of the story, which had been running side by side without touching, came together at last. For the boats of Lethwick were the Crown's property, in a manner of speaking, pledged against the grain debts, soon to be seized. The men aboard them were the Crown's subjects, the very people whose petition had been comforted out of existence in the Rose antechamber. And the news of the disaster reached the palace in the deep of the night, by hard-ridden messenger, and was brought, because every urgent thing was brought to her first, to the Countess Veridine Salomir. What the Countess did with that news in the dark hours before dawn is the hinge of everything that followed. She made a choice. She was the senior lady of the privy household. She controlled access, and access included the access of bad news to the Queen's sleeping ear. She could have woken Saralind at once. That is what the gravity of it demanded. Instead, and I have turned this over 1,000 times trying to be fair to her, and I cannot make it into anything but what it was, she calculated. A great storm and a town in peril was, to the Countess's cornered mind, an opportunity and a danger both. If the Queen woke to it and acted on it, then Lethwick, and the petition, and the whole buried matter of the grain debts would be dragged into the full light of the throne at the worst possible moment for the Countess's smooth paper version of events. But if the news were merely delayed, held, managed the way she managed everything, if it reached the Queen in the morning, through the proper channels, framed and softened, and accompanied by the reassurance that the Coastal Revenue's office was already handling the response, then the crisis could be made to run smooth, like everything else, over the top of the buried thing, and the Queen need never connect the drowning town to the petition she had been asking questions about. So the Countess held the news for 3 hours. She sent no rider north with the Crown's aid. She woke no one. She sat with the storm in her hands in the dark, and she waited for the morning so that she could present it on her own terms. And in those 3 hours, I was on the night post outside the Queen's own apartments, and I watched the Countess come up the stair toward the royal door with the messenger's dispatch in her hand, and then stop 10 feet from where I stood and look at the door and look at the dispatch and make her choice not to knock. I saw her turn away. I saw her go back down the stair to manage the morning. And I understood, standing there in the dark with my rifle and my discipline and my forbidden knowledge, that a town might drown for the Countess's pride while I held my post and said nothing. That was the hour my discipline cost me the most it has ever cost, because the rule of my post was clear. I do not wake the Queen. I do not carry news. I do not interpret the comings and goings of the household for Her Majesty. I stand the door. That is the whole of my charge, and a guard who decides for himself when to break it is no guard at all but a man with opinions and a weapon, which is the most dangerous thing a palace can contain. 19 years I had held that line, and now the line ran straight through a drowning town, and holding it meant holding still while the Countess walked away with men's lives in her hand. I will tell you what I did, and you may judge me as you see fit. I held my post. I did not knock on the Queen's door. I did not chase the Countess down the stair and demand she turn back. I stood the door, exactly as my charge required, through the longest 3 hours of my service, and I have asked myself ever since whether that was discipline, or whether it was the same frightened silence the porters fell into, dressed up in a uniform and a code. I should tell you here, where it belongs, under the weight of that worst hour, how I came to the post in the first place, because it bears on everything. I was not born to palaces. My father kept a lock on the canal in a flat green county 3 days' ride from the capital, raising the gate for the grain barges and lowering it again, a small faithful man who did one small faithful thing his whole life, and was never once thanked for it and never once expected to be. I used to think his life was a waste, one gate, one canal, 50 years. I came to the city at 16 certain I was made for something larger, and I joined the guard imagining glory, the parade and the medals and the great moments. And I learned, slowly and against my will, that the guard is not the parade. The guard is my father's lock. It is the doing of one small faithful thing, over and over, that no one thanks you for, because the realm depends on it being done exactly the same way whether anyone is watching or not. The standing of the door, the signing of the log, the keeping of the record true in the cold at 2 in the morning when the only soul who will ever read it is yourself. It took me the better part of 19 years to stop resenting that and start understanding it. And it took that one worst hour, the Countess on the stair, the town in the water, my whole soul screaming to break my post and be, for once, the man of the great moment to finish the understanding. Because in that hour I wanted, more than I have ever wanted anything, to matter the large way, to knock, to wake the Queen, to be the guard who saved Lethwick. And what held me still was the thing my father knew and I had spent a lifetime too proud to learn, that the man who keeps the gate does not get to choose his moment, and that wanting to be the hero is exactly the wanting that ruins the gate. The Countess wanted to matter the large way too. That was her whole sickness. She and I, in that dark stare, wanted the same forbidden thing, to be the one who controlled how the truth reached the throne. And the only difference between us, the entire difference, was that I had been trained for 19 years to swallow the wanting and keep the gate, and she had been let, for 20 years, to feed it until it ate her. That is what I made my peace with in the years since. The discipline held, and the discipline was right, not because the news did not matter, but because the news did not depend on me. The Countess thought she controlled the only door the storm could pass through. She was wrong. The storm had many doors. And while she walked back down the stair, certain she had bottled the night up in her gloved hands, the news of Lethwick was already coming to the Queen by another road entirely. A road the Countess, in all her management of access, had never thought to close, because it had never occurred to her that the Queen had any source of truth in the world but the one the Countess controlled. The other road was a frightened, exhausted fisherwoman who had not gone home after all. Mistress Orsa had taken the Countess's coin, yes, but she had not used it to go home. She was a woman who had walked 60 miles for her son. She was not going to be bought off by a purse and a kind word, however tired she was. She had used the coin to keep her cot at the charity house another week, and she had spent that week doing the only thing she knew how to do, making herself known to the small, honest people of the river quarter, the porters and the kitchen women and the off-duty guards who drank at the Anchor and the Bell, telling her story to anyone who would hear it, so that if the great front gate would not open for her, perhaps some smaller door would. It was not a clever plan. It was the plan of a desperate woman with nothing left but her own stubbornness, and it worked in the end, for exactly the reason the Countess's cleverness failed, because it did not depend on managing anyone. It depended only on telling the truth to as many people as would listen, and trusting that truth, spread wide enough and thin enough, would eventually reach a person with the power to act on it. The person it reached was the Prince Consort Aldrich. He had a habit, that quiet, half-step-behind man, of walking the river quarter in plain dress in the evenings, alone but for one guard at a discreet distance, and on the night of the great storm, unable to sleep with the wind howling against the palace windows, he had gone down to the quarter to see how the common folk were faring. And in the warm, crowded room of the Anchor and the Bell, where the fishing families of the river quarter had gathered to wait out the storm and to worry aloud about their cousins on the northern coast, he had heard a square-built, red-handed woman tell the room about Lethwick, about the debts, and the boats, and the petition that was comforted out of existence, and the great lady in gray who had held her hands and run out her clock. He had stood at the back, unrecognized in his plain coat, and he had listened to the whole of it. And then he had gone home through the storm and woken his wife. So that while the Countess sat in her rooms 3 hours holding the messenger's dispatch, waiting to manage the morning, the Queen of Eldermoor was already awake, woken not by the official channel the Countess controlled, but by her own husband with a fisherwoman's story in his mouth. And by the time the Countess came down at dawn with her carefully framed account of the disaster and her reassurance that the Coastal Revenue's office was handling everything, she walked into a study that was already lit, already busy, already in motion, with the Queen at the center of it giving orders in a low, steady voice. And she understood in one cold instant that she had lost the race she did not know she was running. I was not in the study, but I came on duty at the changing of the watch that morning, and I stood the door to the Queen's study for the next 12 hours, and through that door I heard the realm's answer to the storm take shape, and I will tell you that it was the finest thing I have witnessed in 19 years of service. The Queen did not panic and she did not perform. She did 3 things in order and each was right. First, she sent the realm's aid north, not as a favor, not as a calculation, but as a plain debt owed. Grain, coin, the royal physicians, the household's own carts, and a column of the palace guard to do the heavy work, all of it on the road north before the sun was fully up. Second, she suspended the Lethwick grain debts entire, by her own seal, then and there, not referred to the proper office, not handled with all due care, but cancelled with her name on the order, so that no man of that town would lose his boat for a debt while his boat was at the bottom of the sea. And third, and this is the thing the realm never forgot, she announced that she would go north herself. Not send go. Her advisers argued against it, and I heard them through the door. The roads were foul, the season was wrong, the danger to her person was real, the symbolism could be achieved by a deputation just as well. And the Queen heard them all out courteously, and then she said the thing I have repeated to myself 100 times since, in the low, even voice she used when she had decided something and would not be moved. A town that has been forgotten does not need to be told it is remembered. It needs to be shown. And there is only one of me, and only one road north, and I am going to take it. And that was the end of the argument. She went north. She rode 3 days through the foul spring roads with a small party and a smaller comfort, and she came into Lethwick on the 4th day, into a town that had lost 4 boats and 3 men and very nearly its whole heart, and she did not stand on a platform and give a speech. She went down to the harbor in the cold rain, and she walked among the wrecked boats with the fishermen, and she sat in the cold charity hall with the widows, and she held the cracked red hands of the people of the coast the way a certain countess had once held them, but for the opposite reason and to the opposite end. And when she left, 9 days later, she left behind a rebuilt harbor wall, a cancelled debt, a granary refilled, and a town that would have walked into the sea for her. The story of it ran ahead of her back to the capital and out across the whole realm, the way such stories do, not by any management, not by any channel the Countess controlled, but by the same wide, thin road of ordinary people telling each other the truth. The Queen who rode north. The Queen who cancelled the debts. The Queen who held the fishermen's hands in the rain. By the time Saralind came home to Harrowgate, she came home to a realm that had, quite without intending to, fallen in love with her. The crowds at the palace gates were 10 deep. The river quarter hung lanterns. And the court, which had spent 4 years treating its young queen as a decoration to be managed, woke up one morning to discover that she had become, overnight and without trying, the most beloved sovereign in the living memory of Eldermoor. This was the false dawn, though it was a false dawn for the Countess, not for the Queen. Because if you had stood in the court those bright days, you would have thought the matter settled, the wrong righted, the good Queen triumphant, and the scheming Countess surely finished. The whole palace thought so. The whole realm thought so. And the Countess herself, watching her Queen ride home to 10 deep crowds, must have felt the ground give way beneath everything she had built. But she was not finished. Not yet. A cornered animal of long power does not lie down when it is beaten. It makes its most dangerous move when it has the least to lose. And the Countess Veridine Salomir, watching the realm fall in love with the woman she had spent 20 years certain was a decoration, did the one thing I had not expected even of her. She decided that if she could not manage the Queen's triumph, she would poison it. She would not attack the Queen's success. She was far too clever for that. To attack a beloved Queen at the height of her love is to destroy yourself. No, she would attack the truth underneath it. She would take the story of Lethwick, the cancelled debts, the harbor wall, the held hands in the rain, and she would whisper in the careful, deniable, unhurried way that was her whole art, that it had been reckless, that the Queen had emptied the granaries on a sentiment, that the suspended debts had set a precedent that would bankrupt the crown when every coastal town with a hard winter came demanding the same mercy, that the ride north had been a vanity, a danger to the succession, a young woman's heart overruling a sovereign's head. She would let the realm have its love story for a season, and then, patiently from the shadows, she would begin to turn that love into doubt, the way she had turned a fisherwoman's hope into gratitude, one quiet word at a time. But before she came to the treasury and the numbers, she made one last attempt to cut the loose thread at its root, and it is worth the telling, because it was the move in which I first saw, plainly, that her cleverness had begun to fail her under pressure. She went after Mistress Orsa. The fisherwoman had become, by then, a small public figure in the capital, not by any seeking of her own, but because the story of Lethwick had a face, and her face was it. The river quarter knew her as the woman who walked. The broadsheets that the printers of the lower town struck off and hawked at the bridge had begun to mention her by name. And to the Countess's cornered mind that small fame was a danger, for as long as Mistress Orsa was beloved, the Queen's ride north was beloved, and as long as the ride north was beloved, the Countess could not turn it into a vanity in the Council's ears. So she set out to spoil the fisherwoman, to make the realm's affection for her curdle, just slightly, into doubt. She did it the only way she knew. She put it about quietly, deniably, through the careful channels that had been hers for 20 years, that Mistress Orsa was not quite what the broadsheets made of her, that she had taken the household's coin and not, as the noble tale had it, refused it, that she had stayed on in the capital chasing notoriety while her own son labored alone on the rebuilt boat, that the simple fisherwoman was perhaps a touch less simple and a touch more grasping than the sentiment of the season allowed. None of it was a lie outright. She had taken the coin. She had stayed in the capital, and that was the Countess's whole genius, to build a falsehood entirely out of true bricks, to tell no lie a clerk could catch while telling, in the sum of it, the largest lie of all. I watched her try it, and I watched it fail, and the failing taught me that the season had truly turned. For the realm had fallen in love with Mistress Orsa for the same reason it had fallen in love with the Queen, because both of them were plainly, unglamorously good, and the people of the lower town could feel the difference between a true thing and a managed one in their bones, the way only people who have been managed their whole lives can. The whispers did not curdle the affection. They slid off it. A kitchen woman of the river quarter asked at the bridge whether it was true the fisherwoman was grasping, is reported to have said. She walked 60 miles for her boy and told the truth in the anchor and the bell. I don't care what she did with the coin. The grand folk who are spreading this had best ask why they're so frightened of a fishwife. And that, the question why are they so frightened began, for the first time, to run the other way up the wide, thin road, not against the Queen, against the shadows that were whispering at her. The Countess heard it come back to her, and she did the thing that finished her, though she did not know it yet. She grew angry. 20 years she had managed her face. Now, told that the river quarter was asking why the grand folk were frightened of a fishwife, she let something show, a tightness, a coldness, a snap at a clerk who brought her the report. I was at the East Gallery post the morning it reached her, and she came through fast, heels striking the marble like that fast clock, and her face was not gracious. It was furious. And a furious face on a woman whose whole power was the gap between her face and her heart is a crack in the dam. I saw it and I knew. She had stopped being able to bear losing. And a schemer who cannot bear to lose will, in the end, reach for the one move too far that loses her everything. She was about to reach for it. It was the treasury. And she would have a perfect instrument for it. Because the Crown's accounts, that spring, genuinely were strained, the aid sent north, the debts cancelled, the harbor rebuilt, all of it real coin that had to come from somewhere. The Countess did not need to invent a danger. She needed only to find a real number, frame it in the worst possible light, and make sure it reached the right anxious ears at the right anxious moment, the great lords of the treasury, the cautious men of the council, the people who had power and feared for the realm's coffers, and could be made, with a well-placed whisper, to wonder aloud whether their beloved young queen was quite as wise as she was good. This was the Countess's last and most dangerous scheme, and it very nearly worked. It is the part of the story where I, the furniture in the corner, the silent witness biding his time, finally came to the moment my whole long patience had been for. Because the Countess, in the executing of this last scheme, made one mistake. She had grown so used to being unwatched, so certain that guards were deaf and walls were blind, that she chose to do her most damning work in a place she believed entirely private. And she chose, of all the rooms in Harrowgate Palace, the one room where I happened to be standing post. The room was the Cartwright Library, a small, dark, book-lined chamber in the Old West Range that the council used for its quietest meetings, the ones that left no minutes. It had one door, and I stood it. For 3 afternoons running, in the second week after the Queen's triumphant return, the Countess held meetings in that room with 2 of the great men of the Treasury, Lord Hask and Lord Penmark, both of them cautious old men who feared for the realm's coffers and trusted the Countess's long experience, and had not yet decided what to make of their suddenly beloved Queen. And I stood the door, and the door was thick, but it was old, and old doors in old palaces have gaps, and I have 19 years of trained hearing and a witness's discipline, and I heard every word. I heard her build her case across those 3 afternoons the way she built everything, patiently, in layers, never showing her whole hand at once. The first afternoon she did nothing but worry gently aloud about the Treasury. Such generosity, the ride north, the cancelled debts, how it had warmed the realm, how it had warmed her own heart. And yet, a steward must be permitted to count the cost, mustn't she? And the cost was real, and someone must have the courage to say so before the realm's love bankrupted the realm. The second afternoon she had numbers, real numbers, the true strained accounts of that spring, framed in the worst light, each figure a small stone laid on the scale against the Queen. And the third afternoon, the afternoon I will remember to the end of my life, she made her move. I say none of this to wound Her Majesty, she said, in that warm, unhurried voice, and through the gap in the old door I could picture her face exactly, the gracious sorrow of it, the sincerity she could summon like a coat. I say it because I love this realm, and because a queen who is good is the most dangerous thing a treasury can have, for goodness spends, my lords, goodness always spends, and there is no end to the towns that have had a hard winter. Today it is Lethwick. Next spring it will be a dozen Lethwicks, every one of them with a fisherwoman willing to walk 60 miles, and what will we say to them? That the Crown's mercy was a single sentiment and not a standing policy. We have set a precedent that will not survive contact with arithmetic. And I fear, I truly fear, my lords, and it costs me to say it, that Her Majesty has not the head for it. The heart, yes. None of us doubts the heart. But the realm is not run on heart. And if those of us who do have the head do not, gently, kindly, find a way to put a steadier hand behind the throne, then I am afraid this beautiful spring will be remembered as the season our good Queen began to ruin us. There it was, 20 years of method distilled into a single afternoon. She was not attacking the Queen. She was loving the realm. She was not seizing power. She was sorrowfully, dutifully, offering to put a steadier hand behind a throne whose occupant had, alas, too much heart and too little head. And Lord Hask and Lord Penmark, 2 frightened old men with the realm's coffers on their consciences, were nodding. I could hear them nodding the small grave murmurs of agreement, the "you raise a fair point, Countess," the "it must at least be considered." She was winning. In that dark room, with the door I guarded shut between her treason and the world, the Countess Veridine Salomir was, by patience and arithmetic and a coat of false sorrow, turning the realm's love for its Queen back into the doubt she needed to survive. And I stood the door, and I heard all of it, and the discipline of my whole life came down to a single point as fine as a needle. Because I could have stopped it right then. I could have opened that door and said, "My lords, I have heard everything, and I will tell you what this woman did to a fisherwoman in the Rose antechamber, and what she did to a record by candlelight in the archive, and what she did with a storm she held in her hands for 3 hours while a town drowned. I could have spent everything I had carried, the candlelight, the held news, the silenced porters, all of it in one righteous flood, right there, to save the Queen. And it would have been the worst thing I could possibly have done. I knew it even as the urge near tore me apart. A guard who bursts through a door he is posted to guard, to denounce a countess to 2 great lords on the strength of what he claims to have overheard. That guard is not a hero. That guard is a madman with a grievance and a weapon, a witness who could not bide his time, and the very wildness of his accusation would be the Countess's salvation. She would weep at the outrage of it. She would have me dismissed for breaking my post and slandering my betters, and rightly. And the doubt she had planted would harden into certainty, because look what the Queen's loyalists are reduced to: accusations from guardsmen, hysteria at the door, the desperation of people who know their Queen is failing. My one wild act would prove her whole case. The truth, spent too soon and in the wrong mouth, would die as a lie. So I held the door. I held it through the worst stillness of my life, with my hand aching to open it and my voice aching to be spent, and a town and a queen and a realm in the balance behind that old oak. And I held it, because the discipline of the witness is not to act when you want to, but to act when the truth can do its work, and the truth's moment was not mine to choose. It was coming. I could feel it coming the way you feel the relief coming at the end of the night post. But it was not here yet, and a witness who moves before its hour is no better than the schemer he means to stop. The truth's moment came 2 days later, and it came, as these things do, as the whole spring had taught me they do, not from any move of mine, but from the Countess's own pride reaching at last beyond what even her cleverness could hold. For she had decided, emboldened by the nodding of Lord Hask and Lord Penmark, to make her case not in a dark library but in the open council, before the full table, before the Queen herself, with the realm's strained accounts laid out for all to see. She believed she had the numbers. She believed she had the great lords half-turned. And she believed, above all, that she was cleverer than the woman she had spent 20 years certain was a decoration. She would stand up in the full council, in a posture of grave and loving duty, and she would lay the cost of the spring before the throne, and she would let the arithmetic do what no accusation could, let it raise, in every cautious mind at that table, the quiet ruinous question of whether their beloved Queen was fit to hold the purse of the realm. It was a brilliant plan. It was the plan of a person who had never once in 20 years lost, and it walked her straight into the one place where every single thing she had buried that spring was waiting, all at once, to come up into the light. Because the Queen had not been idle either. The full council met on the last morning of that long spring, in the great paneled council hall under the high windows, with the whole of the realm's governing court assembled at the long table, the lords of the treasury, the ministers of state, the senior household, the law officers, and at the head of it all the Queen, with the prince consort a half-step behind her chair. I stood the post I had stood for 19 years at the great doors of the hall, immaculate and motionless, eyes forward, furniture. The Countess sat near the foot of the table in her finest gray silk, her papers before her, her face composed into its gracious mask of loving duty. She did not look at me. She never looked at me. I was a fixture of the room, no more to be regarded than the carved oak panels or the cold morning light. The council ran its ordinary course for an hour, the dull necessary business of a realm. And then the Queen, in her low, even voice, invited the senior lady of the privy household to lay before the table the concern regarding the spring's expenditures that she understood the Countess had been so dutifully gathering. And the Countess rose. I will give her this last credit, she was magnificent. She stood, and she gathered the room with her grave, sorrowful eyes, and she began exactly as she had begun in the dark library, with love. Love of the realm, sorrow at the necessity, the heart that none could doubt, the head that the realm so badly needed. She laid out her numbers, the true strained accounts framed in their worst light, each figure landing on the long table like a small cold stone. She spoke of precedent, of the dozen Lethwicks to come, of goodness that always spends. And she built, word by patient word, toward the thing she had built toward all spring, the quiet, sorrowful, ruinous suggestion that their beloved Queen had too much heart and too little head, and that those who loved the realm must, gently, find a way to put a steadier hand behind the throne. She was perhaps 3 sentences from the kill when the Queen raised one finger from the table, and the Countess, out of 20 years of habit, stopped to let her majesty speak. "Thank you, Countess," said Queen Saralind. "You have laid out the cost very clearly. I should like, before the council weighs it, to lay out a few things of my own, so that the table weighs the whole of the matter and not half of it." Her voice was perfectly even. There was no anger in it that any ear could find, and the countess inclined her head graciously, certain still that she held the room, and sat. The queen did not raise her voice. She never did. She simply began to set things on the table, not stones, but truths one at a time, in the order she had chosen, and I watched the countess's face as each one landed, and I will remember that face until I die. First, the queen spoke of the petition, the record of a woman from the northern coast who had requested an audience regarding the Lethwick debts, and who had been recorded as withdrawn over an incomplete form. And then the queen observed mildly that she did not believe a woman who had walked 60 miles withdraws over a form, and that she had asked some questions about it. The countess's gracious face held. This was old ground. She had a smooth paper version of it ready. Then the queen spoke of the record itself, of how the line about the withdrawn petition had grown, between one reading and the next, into a fuller and more reassuring account in a clerk's hand, and of how the ink of the edition was a different black from the ink of the original line, and of how the clerk whose hand it claimed to be had been abed with a fever the entire week the edition was made. A thing easily proven, the queen noted, for the household kept careful records of its sick, and she had them here. And she set a single page on the table. The countess's face held, but the corner of her mouth, the same corner I had watched come loose 2 months before in the East Gallery, came loose again. Then the queen spoke of the archive, of how the petition records were kept under lock, and how the lock's key was held by only 3 people in the household, and how the records of the night watch, the guard's logs, kept faithfully every night at every post, signed and timed, showed that on a certain cold night in early spring, the archive stair had been entered at 11:30 by a single person with a candle, who had remained within for 2.5 hours, and had departed at near 2 in the morning. And the queen observed mildly that the guard who kept that post had logged the entry exactly, as he was bound to do, and had named the person he admitted, as he was bound to do, because a guard's log is the plain truth of who passed, and when, written down each night without fear or favor. And here, for the first time, the countess looked at me. She turned her head down the length of that long table, and she looked at the furniture by the door, at the immaculate, motionless guard she had nodded to that cold night, and told he served well, and I met her eyes, because the moment had come at last, and a witness does not look away when his hour arrives. I did not move. I did not speak. I had no need to. Everything I had carried for 2 months was already on the table in the queen's even voice, set there not by my breaking of my post, but by my faithful keeping of it. For the log I had signed that cold night, the plain disciplined record of who passed and when, was worth more than any flood of accusation I might have loosed through a library door. I had not needed to spend the truth. I had only needed to keep it faithfully, until the one person with the standing to wield it asked for it. That is the whole art of the witness, and in that single look down the length of the table, the countess understood too late, far too late, that the deaf furniture had heard everything, and written it all down, and that her certainty that no one trustworthy was watching had been the foundational error of her whole long life. She looked away from me. She had to, and the queen kept setting truths on the table. She spoke of the porter reassigned to the cold kennels, and the clerk moved to the damp undercroft, and the others quietly punished, naming each, and observing that it was a curious coincidence how every person punished that spring had touched the matter of Lethwick. She spoke of the coin sent to the gate to send a fisherwoman home. And then, last of all, she spoke of the storm. On the night of the great storm, the queen said, and now, for the first time there was something underneath the evenness, something low and hard like stone under water. The news of Lethwick's peril reached this palace by hard-ridden messenger in the deep of the night. It was brought, as all urgent news is brought, to the senior lady of the privy household, who holds the access of news to my ear. The messenger's arrival is logged at the outer gate. The hour is fixed. And I know because my own night guard keeps faithful record of every soul who comes to my apartment door, and at what hour, that no one came to wake me with that news for 3 hours. 3 hours, Countess, while the men of Lethwick were in the water. You held the storm in your hands for 3 hours, so that you might bring it to me in the morning, framed and softened on your own terms, so that I should never connect the drowning of that town to the petition you had buried. I was woken at last, but not by you. I was woken by my husband, who had heard a fisherwoman tell the truth in a public room. The one road of news in this kingdom that you never thought to close, because it never occurred to you that I had any source of truth in the world but the one you controlled. The council hall had gone entirely silent. Every face at the long table had turned to the foot of it, to the woman in gray silk who had risen, 3 sentences from her kill, and now stood with 2 months of buried truths laid out before her in the plain, even voice of the Queen. She had spent 20 years certain was a decoration. And the Countess Veridine Salomir lost her composure entirely. I had waited 2 months to see it, and I will tell you it was not what I had imagined. I had imagined a collapse, tears, a plea, a crumpling. It was not that. What broke in her was not her strength but her mask, and what came up from underneath it was the thing she had hidden under that gracious surface for her whole long life. The envy, raw and ugly and astonished, of a person who has just watched someone she despised prove herself, comprehensively, the better. "You think this makes you fit," she said. It came out before she could stop it, and that, I understood, was the true breaking, the moment 20 years of management failed her in a single sentence. She had never in her life said the thing she felt. Her whole power had lived in the gap between what she felt and what she said, in the gracious smoothness laid over the cold calculation. And now, with the truths on the table and the realm's love in the air and the deaf furniture having heard it all, the gap closed, and the cold calculation came out into the open at last, and it was not clever any more. It was only bitter. "You think a ride in the rain makes you fit to rule," she said, and her voice was rising now, that warm, unhurried voice she had controlled for 20 years climbing up out of her control. "You held some hands. You canceled some debts. You made the fishwives weep and the river quarter hang their little lanterns, and now you imagine you have done the work. But I have done the work, Majesty. I have done it for 20 years in the dark while you were a girl being told to sit up straight. I have kept this palace standing. I have managed the access and the precedence and the 1,000 small, ugly necessities that you are far too good to dirty your hands with, and not one of you would last a season without me. Not one." "Countess," said the Queen, "and you will learn it. You will learn it when the granaries are empty, and the dozen Lethwicks are at the gate, and your beautiful love has spent the realm down to the stone. You will come looking for the steady hand you cast off, and I will not be." "Countess," the Queen did not raise her voice even now, she did not have to. The single word, even and quiet, fell across the Countess's rising flood like a stone wall, and the Countess stopped, breathing hard, her gracious mask gone entirely, her painted mouth come fully loose, her eyes wild and astonished in a way I had never seen them and would never see them again. The eyes of a person who has just heard, in her own voice, the ugliness she had spent a lifetime hiding even from herself, and who knows in the appalled silence after that she has heard it too, and that there is no taking it back. Every face at the long table was turned to her. Lord Hask and Lord Penmark, the 2 cautious old men she had so nearly turned, were staring at the woman whose grave, loving counsel they had been 3 sentences from accepting, and seeing it now for what it had always been. There is no whisper in the world that survives being shouted aloud in a full council. The Countess had spent 20 years making her envy sound like duty by keeping it quiet. She had just made it loud. And in making it loud, in the one unguarded flood of a lifetime, She had done to herself what no enemy and no accusation and no flood from a guardsman's mouth could ever have done to her. She had told the whole governing court of Eldermoor, in her own voice, exactly who she was. I stood my post. I did not move. I had waited 2 months for this, and now that it had come I felt no triumph in it, only the strange grave quiet of a witness whose long stillness has done its work and is over. I had not undone her. The truth had undone her, and her own pride had spent the truth's last coin. All I had done was stand still and keep my post and write down faithfully who passed and when, the smallest things, the furniture's things, and they had been in the end enough. The Queen let the silence hold for a long moment. Then she spoke, and what she said was the measure of her, and the reason the realm was right to love her. "You have done work, Countess," she said quietly. "That is true, and I will not let this room pretend otherwise. For 20 years you kept the small machinery of this house running, and much of it ran well, and the realm owes you for the part of it that was honest service. I say that plainly because it is true, and because I will not answer your unfairness with unfairness of my own." She paused. "But you have mistaken the machinery for the realm. You came to believe that because you controlled the access, you owned the thing that the access led to, that because you managed the door, you were greater than what stood behind it. And so when a fisherwoman walked 60 miles to reach me, you did not see a subject of the crown with a just grievance. You saw a loose thread in your own management. You buried her petition, you forged the record, you punished the honest people who knew of it, and on the night a town drowned you held the news in your hands for 3 hours rather than let it reach me unmanaged, because the smooth running of your machinery had become, to you, more real than the men in the water. That is not the failing of a head too cold for the realm, Countess. That is the failing of a heart that forgot the realm was made of people. You have a great deal of head. It was never your head I doubted." The Countess said nothing. There was nothing to say. The mask was gone and the truth was on the table, and the room had seen the whole of her, and even she, even that endlessly clever woman, could find no smooth word to lay over it. "You are relieved of the office of Senior Lady of the Privy Household," the Queen said, "effective at the close of this council. The matter of the forged record and the held news will go to the law officers, who sit at this table and have heard everything, and they will judge it according to the law, without my hand on the scale either way. You will not be punished beyond what the law finds. I will have no vengeance done in my name, not even on you. But you will not stand behind this throne again. The realm is not run from the shadows any longer, Countess. It is run in the light, where the people can see it. That is the change you could not manage, and it is the change that is going to last." The Countess gathered her papers. Her hands shook, and she could not make them stop, and that more than anything she had said was the thing the room would remember. The woman whose gloved hands had been steady through 20 years of quiet cruelty, unable now to hold her own pages still. She did not look at the Queen again. She did not look at Lord Hask or Lord Penmark, who could not look at her either. She rose, and she walked the length of that long table toward the great doors where I stood, and for one moment passing me she slowed. I thought she might speak. I will admit I braced for it, for some last cut, some final clever cruelty aimed at the furniture that had heard everything. But she did not speak. She looked at me close now, the way she had looked at me that cold night on the archive stair when she nodded and told me I served well, and there was no nod in her now. There was only the appalled, exhausted recognition of a person seeing, fully and for the first time, the witness she had spent 4 years not seeing at all. She understood in that look that I had stood at her shoulder through the whole of it, deaf furniture in the corner, and had carried every move she made faithfully, without fear or favor, until the hour it was needed, and that the smallest, stillest, most managed thing in her whole palace, the brass-buttoned fixture she had presumed beneath her notice, had been the one that, by simply doing its duty, undid her. I did not move, I did not speak, a guard does not. I looked at the middle distance, at the seam between 2 flagstones near the far doors, the same seam I had fixed my eyes upon 2 months before to keep my face still, while a fisherwoman's hope was comforted out of existence. And the Countess Veradine Salomir passed out of the council hall, and out of the office she had held for 20 years, and out of the shadow behind the throne, and I never spoke one word to her in the whole of it. The power of my post was never the power to act. It was the power to withstand, to see clearly and stand still and keep faith with the truth until the truth could keep faith with itself. That is the only power a witness has. On that morning, it was enough. The threads tied off the way true things do, quietly and over time. The law officers found, in the weeks that followed, exactly what the Queen had laid on the table, the forged record, the held news, and they judged it according to the law and not according to anyone's anger. And the Countess was stripped of her honors and her place, and sent to live out her days on a small remaining estate in the dull flat country to the east, neither imprisoned nor pardoned, simply finished, a once great lady in a quiet house. With a great deal of head and a long time to consider the heart she had forgotten. I am told she never spoke of the palace again. I do not know if that is true. I know only that she was never seen in the light of the court, and that the machinery she had run from the shadows did not collapse without her, as she had sworn it would. It simply ran in the open now, slower in some things and fairer in all of them, managed by clerks who could be seen and questioned and held to account, which is the only honest way a realm was ever run. The porter who had brought Mistress Orsa bread was brought back from the cold kennels and given a place at the main gate, with a raise in his wage and a word of thanks from the Queen's own mouth, which he wore prouder than any medal. The careful little clerk Brevis was restored from the damp undercroft to his lodging and his work, and rose, in time, to a place of some trust in the new open household, because the Queen had learned to value the honest man who would not lie about an ink color even when a countess leaned on him. The silenced ones, all of them, were found and restored and thanked. The Queen made a point of it. She said, I heard her say it, that a realm run in the light owed its first debt to the people who had told the truth in the dark, and she paid that debt, every coin of it by name. And Mistress Orsa went home to Lethwick, to a son whose boat had been spared the debt and rebuilt after the storm, in a town that hung the Queen's name in its hearts forever. She had walked 60 miles to be comforted out of her hope by a great lady, and she had refused the comfort, and she had told the truth to a public room, and the truth she told had run up the wide, thin road of ordinary people and woken a queen and brought a realm's aid down on her drowning town, and in the end, undone the proudest woman in the kingdom. She never knew the half of what her stubbornness had set in motion. She thought she had simply, finally, been heard. She had. That was the whole of it, and it was everything. As for me, I went back to my post. The morning after the council, and the morning after that, and the long line of mornings since, the East Gallery, the Rose Antechamber, the Archive Stair, the great doors of the council hall, immaculate, motionless, eyes forward furniture. Nothing about me changed. No one made a song of the guard who kept the log. The realm sang of the Queen who rode north, as it should, and of the fisherwoman who walked as it should, and the deaf fixture in the corner stayed deaf and a fixture, which is exactly as it should be too. A witness who needs to be thanked is no witness at all. But I will tell you the one thing that changed, and it changed only inside me, where no one could see it. For 19 years I had carried, somewhere under the stillness, a small cold doubt about my own discipline, the fear I confess to you, that my biting silence and the porter's frightened silence were the same silence in different coats, and that I would not know which I was wearing until it was tested. That spring tested it. And the test came down, in the end, to the worst 3 hours of my service, standing the Queen's door while the Countess walked away with a storm in her hands, when every instinct in me screamed to break my post and knock and wake the realm, and I held still, and held the line, and trusted that the truth had more doors than the one I guarded. It did, it always does. The Countess's whole undoing was that she never believed it, never believed the truth had any road into the world but the one she controlled, and my whole faith in the worst hour was that it did. I held my post because I believed the truth would find another way to the Queen than through a guardsman who abandoned his door. And it did. It came by a husband and a fisherwoman and a public room and a logbook signed in the cold without fear or favor. The smallest things, the faithful things, the furniture's things. That is the discipline of the man who stands at the post and does not move. It is not the strength to hold still while a fool shouts in your face. That is nothing, an afternoon's annoyance. It is the strength to hold still while a wrong unfolds in front of you and your whole soul demands that you act, and to trust, to truly trust, that your stillness is not surrender but service, that the keeping of the small faithful record is worth more than the loosing of the loud righteous flood, and that the truth, kept clean and unspent until its hour, will undo the proud far more surely than you ever could. The Countess lost everything to her own envy and her own overreach. I never lifted a hand. I only stood my post and saw clearly and kept faith with what I saw. And on the morning the whole thing turned, that was the strongest thing in the room. It still is. I am at my post tomorrow.